Section 2.1 is Introduction to Data Collection. This section may seem like a bit of a jump away from what we did in the first module. In the first module, we were talking all about how to take data sets, collections of numbers, and summarize them and understand them. In section 2.1, we're making a bit of a jump to this notion that these numbers, these data sets, are only useful if they were put together in a reasonable fashion. If we have a data set that is intended to say something about a population, but the way in which we collected it is not appropriate for doing statistical analysis, then we won't be able to say anything about the population. So in this section, what we're going to focus on is understanding the different ways in which data is collected and some of the characteristics associated with this. So the first notion that we'll look at is this idea of how data was collected, in particular, the distinction between an observational study and an experiment. This will be an important distinction that shows up throughout the course. And either of these methods of data collection are fine for statistical analysis, but it's important that you know which it was because that does affect what you'll do in various situations. So the next notion, big picture, that we'll look at in this section is the distinction between different types of variables in statistical studies. And by types of variables here, I don't really mean categorical versus quantitative, although that's something we'll talk about. There's this idea that we're often studying not just variables on their own, but how they relate to each other. And in that situation, we have this notion of an explanatory variable versus a response variable. So an explanatory variable is one that in some sense explains a response variable. It doesn't necessarily cause it to have a certain value, but understanding the value of the explanatory variable will tell you something about the value of the response variable. And the final notion that we're going to look at is this notion of bias versus variability. Variability simply refers to the fact that when we're trying to study a population by instead studying a smaller sample, sample to sample will get different values. That is, we don't really expect a sample to tell us exactly the correct thing about the population. If we're trying to estimate some population parameter like a population mean, we don't expect when we go get a sample of, let's say, 50 people, that the sample mean for those 50 people will be the same as the population mean. And in particular, if we go and get a different sample of 50 people, their sample mean is probably going to be different from the sample mean for the original sample and for the population. So different samples have different values, and those aren't the same as the population, is the idea of variability. And variability is something that we embrace in statistics. We can deal with it mathematically. Bias, on the other hand, we can't really deal with mathematically. Bias is the idea that various things about a study design can cause it to overestimate or underestimate some value. A classic example is if we're trying to do polling for, let's say, a presidential race, and we're trying to see, what percentage of people support a certain candidate. This has changed recently for obvious reasons once you hear what I'm going to say. But it used to be, maybe even 10 years ago, that they would only call landlines. And if you don't know what a landline is, you can understand why this would be a problem. Right? A landline is a phone line that is hardwired into your house that a lot of people don't even have anymore. Right? So they weren't calling people with cell phones. And 10 years ago, 20 years ago, a lot more people had landlines, but it still meant that you were missing a lot of the younger people in the population. And for various questions that you're asking, this may cause you to overestimate or underestimate a certain response, or it may actually not be a problem, but it is a fundamental problem to, in this case, be collecting a sample that's not representative of the population, because the way in which you're collecting it, in this case, calling only landlines and not cell phone lines, was causing you to not get as many younger people in your sample. So just quick recap. Observational study versus experiment is going to be really important for us. And these notions of different roles of variables will be important. But I think the biggest thing from this section that is maybe the trickiest to understand is this notion of bias. And in particular, this idea that it's not really how you use the term bias in regular conversation. It doesn't refer to some intentional thing that a researcher is doing to skew the results. It just refers to some inherent characteristic of study design that's causing a study to not give you results that are representative of the population.